Okay, so back again. The battery on my laptop ran out. Then I had to go to work. So I've just come back and we'll pick it up where we left off for part 2. Alright, so I've run you through the basic EFT procedure. And as I was explaining towards the end of part 1, when we're doing the procedure, by virtue of tapping on different spots, we're actually stimulating different parts of the brain in relation to the sensory cortex. So it's picking up the nerve sensations and it's making sense of those nerve sensations. So in terms of the diagram, the drawing that I've got here, we can say that all these different parts of the brain are being stimulated when we're doing the tapping procedure and we're receiving that nerve stimulation. At the same time, as I'm receiving that nerve stimulation, because I'm doing the tapping, I'm actually generating neurochemical activity in the motor cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that becomes activated when we do anything, when we do any motor activity. So by virtue of doing the tapping, I'm stimulating parts of the sensory cortex, but I'm also stimulating parts of the motor cortex, which is allowing me to do the physical activity. And you can see that there's different parts of the brain that are being stimulated as a result of going through the process. When we're doing what's called the Gamut procedure, where we start tapping on the gamut point and we start doing the eyes closed, eyes open, eyes hard down to the right, eyes hard down to the left, rolling your eyes, etc. What I believe we're doing is we're creating a whole lot of stimulation in the occipital lobe, or the visual cortex at the back of the brain. When you're rolling your eyes, your visual field is cascading and tumbling. And usually our brain will do anything it can to keep our visual field pretty stable. When we're rolling our eyes, our visual field is bombarding the occipital lobe at the back of the brain with visual stimuli. When we do the humming, there's various parts of the brain that become activated when we're thinking of a tune, when we're turning that thought of a tune into some kind of vocal behaviour, when that vocal behaviour is a melodic vocal behaviour, when it brings up childhood associations. Again, there's a whole bunch of different areas that become activated in the brain by virtue of doing that activity. When we count from 1 to 5, there are different areas of the brain again that become activated. It's quite likely that for most people, humming is a right hemisphere activity. Counting is most likely a left hemisphere activity. So different parts of the brain are becoming activated. Now, while we're activating these different parts of the brain, keep in mind while we're doing that, we're actually still generating a whole lot of electrochemical activity in the amygdala relating to feeling nervous about the exam tomorrow or about the sandwich that we nearly choked on. So we've got a whole lot of electrochemical activity happening there. At the same time as we're creating all these different areas of brain stimulation through doing the process. And what it does is it begins to send out electrochemical activity out to these parts of the brain that are being stimulated. There's a truism in neuroscience that says what fires together wires together. And basically we're firing these different parts of the brain at the same time as we're firing up the amygdala, and essentially what that does is it makes these different areas begin to fire together. So having a close look at that picture, you can see what I've drawn there is electrochemical activity leaving the amygdala area and beginning to go out to parts of the brain that are being stimulated at the same time, with this idea that what fires together wires together. Now, keeping that picture in mind, what this becomes very much like is, believe it or not, dirt roads. And anybody who's ever lived on dirt roads will be familiar with the description I'm about to give you, but Those that have never lived on dirt roads may not be familiar with it. But when you live on a dirt road and it rains heavily, then the water rushes across the lowest point of the road and cuts a channel. And the more that it rains, the deeper that channel gets, because more water rushes down it and eventually hollows out more of that channel. If you want to fix that problem, there's no point coming along with a wheelbarrow load of gravel and just simply filling up the channel, because the next time it rains, the same thing will happen again. The water will just simply rush through that lowest point, and it's going to take all the new gravel with it and deepen that channel again. If you want to fix the problem, what you need to do is you need to get out there with a mattock, and just near the lowest point you need to cut what are called feather drains. So these are small drains that divert water away from across the road, so that when it rains the water will come down and it will hit these small feather drains and divert water away from the channel. You can then fill up the channel with gravel and it's not going to get washed out. The relevance of that to this is that each one of these areas, you can think of each one of these areas that have been stimulated, and the new wiring that happens with that is being similar to a feather drain, so that you can think of the storm water, the heavy inundation of rain happening in the amygdala, and rather than just going around the same channel, down the same channel that it usually travels on, the same neural pathway, it begins to divert electrochemical activity out to these different areas of the brain that are being stimulated. Now, rather than infecting the rest of the brain with anxiety, keep in mind it's primarily the amygdala that does fear, anxiety and anger. So that when electrochemical activity and energy goes out to these different areas of the brain, they're not going out to areas of the brain that do fear, anxiety and anger. There's other parts of the brain do all sorts of wonderful things apart from fear, anxiety and anger. So you can think of when we're doing that stimulation, and we're stimulating different parts of the brain by virtue of the nerve stimulation as well as the motor activity, while we're still repeating the phrase about the thing that we're wanting to change, we're still stimulating the amygdala through that verbal statement. Essentially what we're doing is creating new neural pathways. So keep in mind that every brain cell has 7,000 to 10,000 tentacles coming off it, and that means that there's 7,000 to 10,000 different alternative pathways for the electrochemical activity to travel down, rather than the same old neural pathway, which is the fear pathway. Okay? I've seen video footage of the axons and the dendrites of brain cells, these tentacles, actually beginning to physically move in order to form new neural pathways. I've seen video footage of that happening, so it's been captured on film. So we're not speaking metaphorically here, but the tentacles, the axons and dendrites will actually begin to physically move in order to form new neural pathways, which then further take, like the feather drains, take that electrochemical activity away from that old well-travelled pathway in the amygdala. And that essentially is more of a neuropsychological understanding of what could possibly be going on with EFT. Now, when to use EFT? And really there's two main times that you might like to use it. One is when you're experiencing a particular problem in real time. So you're in the moment of feeling highly anxious or feeling highly fearful, feeling frightened, feeling angry, whatever the intense feeling might be, and you're wanting to reduce the intensity of that feeling. So we'll call that doing EFT in real time. And essentially the setup phrase will say something like, even though I feel highly anxious, I deeply and completely accept myself. The reminder phrase will be feeling highly anxious, feeling highly anxious, feeling highly anxious. So you're doing that when you're actually in that state of feeling anxious. The more that you do the procedure, the more it's going to bit by bit reduce that level of anxiety. So keep on rating the level of anxiety from 0 to 10 before you do it. Rate it again after you've done the procedure one time through. If you feel the need to keep on doing it in order to reduce that anxiety further, then keep on doing the procedure until it's come down to a level that you feel comfortable with. The other time that you might do EFT is in anticipation. So the example that I gave before of anticipating, or let's say feeling anxious about an exam tomorrow, that's an anticipatory anxiety. So anxious about something that's not happening now, but we know is going to be happening tomorrow. So the wording of the setup phrase, as I gave in the example, is even though I feel anxious about the exam tomorrow, you're anticipating the exam tomorrow and you're feeling anxious now. Well, again, that's actually doing it in real time because you're feeling the anxiety now. But let's say if you are feeling okay at the moment, but you know that every time you go into an exam, you tend to become highly anxious and you can get overwhelmed by anxiety. You're not feeling anxious at the moment, you just know tomorrow when you go into the exam, that's what's likely to happen. So you would then use EFT in an anticipatory manner. So you'd say, even though tomorrow I'm likely to feel anxious when I undergo the exam, I deeply and completely accept myself. Or even though I may feel anxious tomorrow during the exam, I deeply and completely accept myself, etc. Now, the sorts of things that EFT is very good for, primarily anxiety, and that's where a lot of the research has been done. Last time I looked into it, EFT had been granted a status by the American Psychological Association as being a probably efficacious treatment, which means that there was enough evidence to indicate that it's probably efficacious, it probably works. It simply takes somewhere between 20 and 30 years for a new intervention to have accumulated enough research evidence to be granted a status of an evidence-based treatment. And EFT is still in that process. But there's plenty of evidence, which you'll find on the EFT Universe website, plenty of evidence that shows that EFT works really very well for anxiety conditions, anxiety problems. The other issue that I've found it to work really well with is sleep problems. And I've discussed this in detail in my book, Getting the Zs That You Want, Sleep Sense in the 21st Century, which is available for order from my website. One of the big problems with sleep is that we tend to become highly, when we're struggling with sleep, we tend to become highly anxious about the whole concept of sleep. The whole proposition of trying to go to sleep tends to generate a lot of anxiety. And of course that anxiety tends to make it very difficult for us to be caught by the next wave of sleepiness that comes our way. And the longer that we spend in bed tossing and turning and getting agitated, the more anxious we're getting about sleep and anxious about how dreadful tomorrow is going to be, etc. And so EFT can be a really helpful thing for sleep problems like that. Now again, we can use EFT either in real time in regards to sleep if we're experiencing sleep problems, or we can use it in an anticipatory manner if we expect to have sleep problems. Using it in real time, you want to get a clear sense about what is the issue that's interfering with my sleep. Am I feeling anxious about not being able to sleep? Am I worried about what I'm going to be like tomorrow? Am I getting aggravated or angry with noise interfering with my ability to sleep, etc.? And you want to make your setup phrase and your reminder phrases reflect what your actual experience is. If you're finding it hard to go to sleep, then it needs to reflect that. If you've woken up and you're finding it hard to get back to sleep, again, it needs to reflect that. If you're waking up too often, it needs to reflect that. So if you're finding it hard to go to sleep, then you may use the setup phrase, even though I'm finding it hard to get to sleep, I deeply and completely accept myself. And the reminder phrase is finding it hard to get to sleep, finding it hard to get to sleep, etc. One thing I've found through my own experiences with it is if I'm finding it hard to get to sleep at night or early in the morning, and I start to physically do the process, that tends to wake me up because it's a physical activity. And what I discovered is that this process will work just as well if you do it in your imagination. Now, all professional athletes and professional music performers and professional dancers, etc., know this. And as a result, what professional performers do is that for every time that they're actually doing the performance, whether it be an athletic performance or music or dance, they've probably done it 10 times in their head, in their imagination, and watching themselves performing the perfect action. You'll often see this with, say, Olympic athletes before their event. You might see them sitting off to the side with their eyes shut, and you can bet what they're doing is they're running through in their imagination, seeing themselves perform the perfect action. Now, professional athletes and performers wouldn't do that if it didn't work. Clearly it does work. And it works because our brain is not very good at distinguishing between what we imagine happening and what is actually happening. So what I discovered is if I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm finding it hard to get back to sleep, and I want to use EFT to help me to do so, then if I'm to do it physically, I'm probably going to be waking myself up more, which is not conducive at all. If I do it in my imagination, then that is conducive to sleep. It's not a very exciting process to do. It's more complex than watching sheep jump over a fence and counting sheep. You've actually got to think about it because it's a step-by-step process, and you've got to be thinking about what's the next step in the procedure, etc. So what I will do in my imagination is I'm lying there in sleep position with my eyes shut and imagining tapping on my karate chop point and imagining saying to myself, even though I'm finding it hard to get back to sleep, I deeply and completely accept myself. And then the reminder, finding it hard to get back to sleep. Again, doing it all in my imagination, finding it hard to get back to sleep, finding it hard to get back to sleep, finding it hard to get back to sleep, etc. When I'm doing it in my imagination, I don't tend to do the Gamut procedure. I tend to just start at the karate chop point, go to my eyebrow, all those spots that I've shown you, all the way through to the thumbnails, and then I go back in my imagination to start there, and I just keep on repeating that cycle. Because it's not exciting, there's nothing terribly interesting about it, and yet you've got to think about it, it tends to absorb the excess amount of electrochemical activity which your brain is doing, which is keeping you awake. So we tend to wake up when we've got a whole lot of stuff, a whole lot of electrochemical activity whizzing around in our brains, and our mind will just look for anything to focus on. Well, if you choose to focus on the EFT procedure, then you're giving your mind something to focus in on. You've got to think about it, yet it's not interesting, it's not exciting, it's repetitive, it's actually really quite boring. And what I find is that it tends to lull my mind into a stupor, which is highly conducive to sleep. So after about 5 minutes or so of just repeating the same thing, typically what I will notice is that my mind starts to come up with gibberish. When I'm trying to repeat the reminder phrase, my mind starts saying things like pink marshmallow mountains or just some kind of gibberish. And I know if I persevere for another 30 seconds, I'm going to be asleep. So when my mind starts to lose the plot and forgets what the procedure is or forgets the actual reminder phrase and starts saying gibberish instead, I know I'm very close to just being asleep. If I push a little bit further, then I will be asleep. So that's how I use EFT for sleep in real time. Again, you've got to make it reflective of what's going on for you. If you're anxious about family problems and the anxiety around that is stopping you from sleeping, then that needs to be part of your setup phrase and your reminder phrase. So even though I'm anxious about what's happening in my family at the moment or what's happening with my children, I deeply and completely accept myself. So you make it reflect what's actually going on for you. If you wake up and your mind is just racing 1,000 miles an hour, you might say, even though my mind is racing 1,000 miles an hour, I deeply and completely accept myself. Again, doing that in your imagination for 5 or 10 minutes tends to lull your mind into a state which is highly conducive for sleep. And that's doing it in real time. Now, if you have predictable sleep problems, if you're in a poor sleep pattern and you tend to be waking up, really early, too early in the morning and finding it hard to get back to sleep, or you're waking up too many times during the night, then what I do in that circumstance is before I turn the light out, I might be reading in bed for a while, before I turn the light out, I'll actually do a physical round of EFT, and I'll say, even though I may wake up too easily and too often, and I may find it hard to get back to sleep. Now, if they're all the components of my sleep problem, I've got 3 different elements to that. Even though I may wake up too easily and too often, that's one component. And I may find it hard to get back to sleep, and that's another component. I deeply and completely accept myself. And then in reality, I'm doing this physically, not in my imagination. May wake up too easily and too often. May find it hard to get back to sleep. May wake up too easily and too often. May find it hard to get back to sleep, etc. And I'll do 1 round of that before I actually turn the light off and go to sleep. Now that's in anticipation, because I'm not actually having that particular sleep problem before I've tried to go to sleep. I don't want to say, even though I will wake up too easily and too often and find it hard to get back to sleep, because that's kind of saying that I'm going to have the problem, and I don't want to say that. So I say, even though I may wake up too easily and too often and find it hard to get back to sleep, I deeply and completely accept myself. So that's doing it in anticipation. You can do that. You don't have to wait until you're turning the lights out. If you've got a solid problem like a regular sleep problem, I would suggest that you do this process about 6 times a day. And you don't have to wait before you're just going to sleep. You could do it starting in the morning when you wake up. Even though I may find it hard to get to sleep tonight, I deeply and completely accept myself. And you can do that 4 to 6 times during the day. Which brings up the question about how often to do EFT. A way of thinking about it, as I said before, is that when you first do the procedure, you're creating new neural pathways. Those tentacles, the axons and dendrites begin to link up. The more that you do the procedure, the more you're actually strengthening these new neural pathways. You're giving them more and more traffic. If you do it 6 times a day, then that newly created neural pathway becomes a more well-travelled path. The more that you do it, the more you're strengthening the new neural pathway. There's still the old neural pathway there, which is the problematic one, but you're now putting more energy more electrochemical energy into the new neural pathway, which strengthens that. And the more that you do that over more days, and the more that you persevere with it, not only have you created new neural pathways, but you've really strengthened those new neural pathways, and they begin to compete with the old neural pathways. So that when the problem's happening again, if you've got more exams coming up, and there's something like an electrical storm happening in your amygdala to do with feeling anxious about the exam, well, some of it's going to go down the old neural pathway, and some of it's going to go up the new neural pathways that you've created. So like the feather drains, it begins to siphon out that electrochemical activity away from your amygdala, and it discharges the amygdala of the intensive charge that it's carried so far. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. What I suggest you do, if you want more information, no doubt there's many explanatory videos on EFT on the net these days. It's just a matter of looking for them. The EFT Universe website is loaded with information, and it has articles linking to research that's been done with EFT. There's instruction manuals, etc. So if you want more information about EFT, I'd suggest you go to that EFT Universe. Okay, thanks for watching and good luck with it.